This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. If it's hot where you are, join the club. This is what I like to call multi-purpose towel season. I'm all about carrying around a useful little towel so you can dab the sweat once you get indoors. I swear by it, and you're gonna thank me. Something else you're gonna thank me for, each week throughout this month, we're looking at the changing dynamics around the multi-billion-dollar business of sports and how dollars and cents shape the games we love both on and off the field. And even if you don't love sports, we think you'll dig the stories, the experts, and the surprising impacts these issues can have well beyond the world of sports. We're going to keep track of it all in our new series from In the Loop, Scoreboard. For our first installment of Scoreboard, we're starting with a subject that can be pretty divisive among sports fans: analytics. Professional athletes might be the most carefully measured professionals out there. People around the world can know how you're doing at your job with a couple of clicks. They can see how many times you meet your goals, how efficient you are at it, and exactly how well you're doing. And the game is changing fast. Baseball players have ditched so-called small ball to swing for the fences every time. Basketball players fire from well beyond the three-point line instead of shooting jumpers closer to the basket. Across sports, gameplay is shifting to be as optimized as possible, and it all ties back to the recent boom in sports analytics.
People have a thirst for data. When it comes to sports stats, advanced stats, and analytics.
You can trust John Tobias on this one. He's a statistician for ESPN and a professor at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. He's also the founder of Strength in Numbers, a nonprofit that teaches sports analytics to minority and female high school students. And he knows better than most just how important stats are for fans.
I just think a lot of times when it comes to stats, I think it kind of proves your argument. Because, you can have an argument, but you have to base it on something.
And as the known universe of sports stats grows every day, the development of analytics and advanced metrics has become a crucial tool, not just for fans, but for teams and players too. Take it from Liz Wandless. She's a professor at Ohio University who teaches sports analytics. And before she entered academia, she was a professional shot putter who was an All-American in college.
This obviously looks very different from when I competed, but with the advance of technology to measure what athletes are doing, there's more data to collect. With the understanding that if we can quantify fitness measures, performance measures, those types of things, that gives us a leg up in what we are doing.
That chance for a leg up has offered a new path for teams in smaller markets and allowed owners looking to field a team on the cheap to still succeed against clubs with larger budgets. And in some cases, it's turned around the fate of long-suffering teams. In basketball, the Golden State Warriors spent over a decade as one of the worst teams in the league, missing the playoffs 17 times in an 18-year stretch. But in the early 2010s, they found two young stars who happened to shoot three-pointers really well. Do you know their names? Stephen Curry and Klay Thompson. The Warriors looked to take advantage of this through analytics. They were one of several teams that improved their data collection to figure out where and when they shot the ball. They quickly realized that, other than shots very close to the basket, it was more efficient to take a few steps back and try to score 3 points instead of 2. Because if I remember my elementary school math correctly, 3 is greater than 2. Yeah, sometimes analytics in sports are pretty straightforward, but there's a bit more to it than that. We talked about this with Seth Partnow. He's the director of basketball at the sports analytics site StatsBomb. He's also a former director of basketball research for the Milwaukee Bucks and the author of a whole book on basketball shots called The Mid-Range Theory. He told us that the more data teams got about shots, the more the trade-off in stepping back to the three-point line made sense.
Once we started to get that data in, when shot charts and things like that started to come out, was when people really started to realize that, yes, efficiency, accuracy, at least in NBA players, drops off some from 17 feet to 24 feet, but not nearly as much as enough to overcome the extra point you get from that.
Saying Golden State's new approach worked was an understatement. The Warriors won 3 championships in 5 years And in those other 2 years, they still made the NBA Finals and also set the record for most wins by any team in a season ever. Steph Curry has now made more three-pointers than any other player in NBA history, and he did it in 5 fewer seasons than the previous record holder, if I'm not mistaken. That's Ray Allen. And now, as teams invest more heavily in analytics, basically every team has joined in, with NBA teams attempting roughly twice as many three-pointers now as they did in the year before Curry entered the league in 2009. But it's not necessarily the case that teams are better these days. They've just discovered a new tool. James DeTore, a senior staff writer at the sports site SB Nation, has written about the proliferation of the three-point shot in the NBA. And he told us the Warriors weren't the first team to shoot a ton, but they turned it into championships.
The big thing that the Warriors were doing wasn't necessarily that they were taking more threes. The difference is they were more accurate doing it, because obviously they had 2 amazing shooters in Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, still do for that matter. But they were hitting points at hitting their shots at such a high mark that they were kind of the volume shooters. So instead of spreading it to all 5 guys, they just let them take as many as possible.
And while not every team could win titles like the Warriors, other teams who made the switch early still reap the rewards.
A team that got a lot of benefit by being early adopters was the Houston Rockets. I think that for a number of years, they gained advantage probably worth maybe even a half a dozen wins a year just by taking shots from higher value locations than everyone else.
And there are other examples in other sports. The Tampa Bay Rays have become a regular contender in Major League Baseball by investing heavily in analytics, despite also being one of the league's lowest spenders. In baseball, most teams still use the traditional approach. A starting pitcher goes more than halfway through the game and then turns the ball over to relief pitchers. But now, teams like the Rays are lightening the load on starters and using more relief pitchers. And they have literally changed how the game starts.
One of the ways they tried to hijack the game, if you will, is essentially moving past the starting pitcher. They didn't have someone take the ball every 5th day and attempt to work 5, 6, 7 innings just because that's what tradition says they should have done. What they did instead was they would start a pitcher who usually was a middle reliever or even a setup pitcher, and they would let them go an inning, maybe 2 innings, and then they would insert someone and they would let them go 3 to 4, maybe 5 innings, depending on the score and how they're pitching and whatnot.
That's RJ Anderson, a baseball staff writer at CBSSports.com and someone who has written about baseball analytics for over a decade. As he points out, the Rays found data that showed that when their pitchers stayed in the game long enough to face hitters a 3rd time, they did a lot worse. Using an opener also means that pitchers don't have to face as many hitters. That also allows them to use more energy to throw harder and more aggressively. And that has a knock-on effect for the rest of the game.
Hitters have responded by really adapting to these uppercut swings. The thinking is basically, we're not going to string together 3 or 4 consecutive hits against these pitchers anymore. Not with quality of pitches they're throwing, not with the defenses we're seeing. So how do we score runs? And the answer in the hitter's mind has been to swing for the fences.
But as analytics become a bigger and bigger part of the game, not everyone is happy. In baseball, where analytics have taken arguably the strongest foothold, there's a worry that they've become too much a part of the game. Fans often lament how changes like hitters striking out more, defenses shifting to optimal positions, or the increase in relief pitchers have produced a game with less action and moving at a slower pace. Fans have a point on that last one. Data from the stat site Baseball Reference shows that regular 9-inning games in 2021 averaged 3 hours and 10 minutes. That's the longest average game length ever, and a whole 24 minutes longer than the same game in 2005. A Harris poll conducted just before the 2021 season on behalf of The Athletic found that 80% of all fans and nearly 90% of very avid fans said they agreed with the idea that analytics are taking over games too much and shaping how players play the game. But even as analytics create some minefields and split up fans, they're not going away anytime soon, especially as teams and individuals use them to find new ways to win. So let's dig in with baseball. which has the longest track record in most major sports of teams and writers using advanced metrics and some of the most vocal backlash to it. Joining us now is Craig Goldstein. He's the editor-in-chief of Baseball Prospectus, one of the leading sites dedicated to covering baseball using sabermetrics. I love saying that word, sabermetrics and analytics. Craig, thanks so much for joining us here on In the Loop. I want to start big picture, man. How different does the usage of analytics in baseball look compared to other sports?
Yeah, I think in broad strokes, it looks very similar, but maybe a bit further along down the same path. A lot of what other sports have done have, I think, built on what baseball started with. And it makes sense that it started with baseball because there are so many isolated matchups, pitcher versus batter, whereas other sports have much more going on all at the same time. And I think baseball was also able to capitalize on more individual sports because of those one-to-one matchups between batters and pitchers, like golf. They've adapted a lot of the technology that they use from golf, from TrackMan systems, which track the flight of the ball. That's going to work in baseball similarly, not exactly the same, but similarly as it does in a sport like golf.
Why is there such a considerable backlash to the use of analytics in baseball? And what do you say to people who raise the thought, there's too much of it and too much analytics and too much numbers in baseball? What do you say to those folks?
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to some degree. I mean, obviously, this is something I'm very passionate about, but I do understand what people mean. I think that there can be adverse effects on the aesthetics of the game. And I think people are resistant to change in almost any capacity. And I think an obvious thing for baseball is the rise of what we call the three true outcomes. That's strikeouts, walks, and home runs. People like to see balls in play. They like to see athletic defenders make plays. They like to see doubles and guys running the bases. They like to see triples and stolen bases. What I would say is I like all of those things too. I want to see more of them also. But it's understanding that the way that the sport works rewards these three true outcomes in a way, incentivizes them in a way that that is what has carried this strategy and the approach of batters and pitchers to prioritize, strikeouts on the pitcher's end and home runs and walks on the batter's end. So what I would say again to people who don't like it is I certainly understand. I'm not a fan of all the changes that analytics, quote unquote, have brought with them. But those were incentives that existed the whole time. People just didn't always understand them.
Sometimes a lot of these new stats, things like WAR or launch angles, can be confusing to viewers like myself. I'm using myself as an example here, or even casual fans. But how can some of these more advanced analytics be used as tools to appreciate the game people are watching at home?
One of the things that I try and tell people who aren't as familiar with advanced metrics and things like that is that so many of them actually reinforce what we understood about baseball in the first place. It's just, again, providing that measurement, providing the data to reinforce what we knew to be true before. A great example of this is framing metrics for catchers. We saw a lot of catchers who weren't good hitters, but baseball people would tell you pitchers love throwing to them. Well, what does that mean? Just that they have a good relationship with the pitcher? Not necessarily, maybe, but not necessarily. What it meant was that this pitcher could miss his spot a little bit, could throw a ball, and the catcher would turn it into a strike. He would get the umpire to call it a strike because he was really deceptive in his movements. These are all things that baseball people appreciated about catchers for a long time, but we didn't necessarily know the full value until we were able to put some numbers around it. But I love it as a tool to understand that the people who watch the game for their life, who are baseball people, they know what they're talking about. And often they're proven correct by these advances we make in data, which is, again, really ascribing numbers to things that they already know.
Craig Goldstein is the editor-in-chief of Baseball Prospectus, one of the leading sites dedicated to covering baseball using sabermetrics and analytics. Craig, thank you so much, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.